Hello and welcome to this CIPS Futures mini-series, brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply and partnered with Resolution. Hello and thank you for joining us on this first episode of a new CIPS Futures podcast mini-series. Over 3 episodes, we're going to be focusing on navigating supply disputes, covering everything from why disputes happen in the first place to the important behaviours the procurement need for managing this kind of conflict. Plus, how might AI support all of this in the future? Well, we'll find out with our guests over the next 3 episodes. I'm James Moore, part of the CIPS editorial and content team, and I'm delighted to be hosting this mini-series, which we're running in partnership with CIPS official knowledge partner, Resolution. As a short intro, Resolution helps to reduce cost, delays, and disruptions occurring from disputes and conflict with its AI-powered cloud-based platform. As a commercial tool, it is designed to help those managing suppliers develop more resilient commercial relationships and to resolve disputes more quickly. And of course, as with all our episodes of CIPS Futures, you can find out more about Resolution in the link in the episode's description. So, navigating supply disputes. Why have we chosen this topic? Well, as procurement navigates a more volatile, a more uncertain environment, this is creating more frequent misalignment with suppliers and contractual relationships. As a result, faster and clearer resolution of disputes really matters. We're not just saying this is what we're hearing from you as well. This is what you're telling us. Earlier this year, CIPS and Resolution ran a joint survey on supplier disputes, and some of those findings will actually form the basis of the conversation for this series. And we know this is a critical part of the job. Procurement is, as ever, on the front line in managing suppliers, but 90% of those surveyed said that conflict and dispute resolution should be a core procurement competency. On top of this, half said that the time taken to settle serious disagreements is increasing, with financial and reputational consequences often the end result. So, in today's episode, we're going to look to explore some of the common causes of conflict and also some of the causes of why conflict is increasing in frequency. While episode 2, we will uncover some of the early warning signs of disputes, as well as the behaviours you need to manage them when they do happen. And our final episode will ask whether AI might be well suited to support these challenges, with lots already on procurement's plate as it is. So let's get going and welcome our guests for this episode. First up, we have Joanna Ingram, Chief Revenue Officer at Resolution. Welcome, Jo. It's great to have you on. Do you just want to introduce yourself briefly, maybe share a little bit about your own experience in kind of managing disputes and conflicts?
Thank you very much for having me, James. I lead the commercial team at Resolution, and we help organisations to reduce contract risk, build stronger, more collaborative relationships with their partners, and resolve conflicts and disputes more quickly and cost effectively. So over the last 25 years, much of my career has actually been spent working with partners, often on the supplier side. And of course, it's natural that not everything goes to plan. When this has happened, I've tried to focus on finding solutions that genuinely work for both parties. Our founder, Faye, she actually brings a different but complementary perspective. She's got a wealth of experience managing conflicts and disputes for large organisations, both in the public and private sector, and knows how to de-escalate and resolve them when they arrive. Together, we bring a broad perspective on both partnership building and dispute resolution. It's a good blend.
Yeah, perfect blend. And we're going to hear from Faye episode 2 and 3. So we're looking forward to hearing more from Faye. And we also have CIPS trainer Kurt Warren with us today. And I'm sure, Kurt, that's not your only title. So I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and also share a little bit about the work that you do with CIPS.
So I'm Kurt Warren. I'm a chartered fellow of CIPS, and I'm one of their senior global trainers around the world. I've been in procurement and supply chain for nearly 4 decades now, moving around the world. I'm working in Asia, the Middle East, USA, UK, Europe, and I'm also a qualified commercial lawyer. And we're going to talk about disputes and why do we have disputes, etc. It doesn't matter which country you're in, doesn't matter what language you come from. There is a theme that goes through all of the time, and hopefully we'll explore a bit more about that later on.
Joe, I kind of mentioned in the introduction around the joint CIPS resolution survey that we ran on supply disputes. So we asked procurement and supply professionals to share their kind of experiences of it all, give some insight into what kind of disputes they're facing at the moment and the role that they're playing in tackling and managing those disputes. So we'll put a link in the episode description where you can download the report. But what really stood out to you, Joe, particularly around why commercial disputes are happening at the moment?
So there were two things that really stood out to me in the survey. Firstly, it was disputes aren't usually triggered by dramatic breaches or poor behaviour. Often they just stem from everyday breakdowns. So things like unclear documentation, changing requirements, or just poor communication. In fact, a quarter of respondents pointed to poorly drafted documentation and another quarter to shifting business needs mid-contract as the main causes of disputes. The big takeaway was that conflict usually stems from ambiguity and not from people being deliberately unfair. It was more about misalignment rather than bad intentions. And I think the second thing that really stood out for me was the duration and the cost of these disputes. So more than 60% of disputes dragged on for over a month and 13% were more than 6 months. And the costs of the conflicts were high. So many of the conflicts that were being managed were over £1 million and some were even over 5 million. 73% of professionals reported that financial and reputational costs were also rising. So the outcomes of these disputes were really important. They're not minor issues, as you can tell. They're strategic risks that can stall major projects and negatively impact relationships if they're not resolved properly.
One of those things that stands out there is 13% are taking more than 6 months. That's a huge amount of time taken from a procurement and supply professional's role, everything else that they could be doing, building strategic relationships, and also an ongoing dispute, I suppose, can snowball into poor relationships with suppliers that can have longer term effects as well. So it's really interesting to hear, and thank you to those who did respond to the survey. We really appreciate it. Kurt, keen to bring you in here. In your experience, did some of those findings that Joe just shared chime with you? Are there any others that you're seeing as the typical causes of disputes, particularly between procurement and suppliers?
It's almost like Joe is echoing everything that happens around the world in procurement and supply chain. The key thing is misalignment and truly understanding the scope with regarding to the contract and the ambiguous language that's actually put into the term of the contract and their interpretation of what is the requirement. But the main reasons why contracts break down and we have disputes is because the terms aren't widely understood and the roles and responsibilities within each party aren't understood. And therefore, we end up with almost like a blame game between the internal customer and procurement and supply. And then we have procurement and supply blaming the supplier and the supplier blaming everybody, where it really does come down to a misalignment of really everybody's roles and responsibilities in the execution and delivery of the contract.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. And we talk about misalignment, and this isn't necessarily done on purpose, I suppose. People aren't, don't want to have disputes, ideally. And Joe, if we just sort of take a step back here and think more broadly and look at the context that we're seeing right now with the likes of tariffs coming in from the Trump administration or geopolitical conflict from the last couple of years, and we saw lots of force majeure contract clauses being put into effect during COVID, I believe. How do these big kind of macro external events that obviously are out of the control of a lot of procurement and supply professionals and their suppliers as well, how do they filter down to procurement supply relationships, and can they create quite difficult challenges in terms of contracts and disputes from happening?
Yes, absolutely. There is certainly a lot happening out there at the moment, and unfortunately, it's very unpredictable. Geopolitical conflicts, along with external forces like tariffs, changes in regulation, or funding constraints, often create ripple effects. So, for instance, changes in policy or compliance standard were cited by both public and private sector as causes for conflict in our report. These macro events often end up highlighting where there are weaknesses in contracts, And when unforeseen external challenges hit, they often expose misalignment in supplier expectations, especially if the contract doesn't allow for flexibility.
There are big events that happen and they can create snowball effects. But as you explain, it often shows the weaknesses of these contracts. And Kurt, is that something you've seen as well? And I know you work around the world to help supporting procurement teams. This isn't just a UK thing or a US thing. This is happening globally, is it?
Absolutely. And it's a great shout out with regarding to the geopolitical situation. What people do have to do when they actually create a contract is they have to understand the supply chain, and they have to understand the risks within the supply chain that are going to be part of that contract and the execution of that contract. And therefore they can mitigate risks and have those expressed within the contract, etc. And recently, I know I've been in Oman recently working with CIPS over there with a client, and the geopolitical situation over there with regarding to the Suez Canal and entering into the Suez Canal, rather than a 26-day sailing for the vessel to go out, come back in, refill, we're talking about 35 days. And now we have a dispute in the contract, not only of the contract with the supplier for the vessel, but now a dispute with the actual customer. These are happening, wars are happening, tariffs are happening, and we need to build in more resilience within our contract. And the only way we can do that is looking at our supply chain when we actually create the contract, and therefore have mitigation within there. And there's another great point on the tariffs and also commodity prices. This affects contracts. And a lot of the times people say, oh, the price is going up. We're not accepting it from the supplier. It's not the supplier's fault. This is happening. The commodity prices are changing. And therefore, we have to have a pricing mechanism within the contract to be able to have that. Otherwise, it just leads to dispute. And the supplier has no choice, but the contract comes under frustration and the supplier can't supply. And then, oh, that's it. We've got a legal dispute. We're going to court. And that's sold to nobody.
Why does this matter so much for procurement? Some people might argue is this the legal team's problem to work out, but actually our report showed that 90% of those who we surveyed felt that dispute resolution or conflict management should be a core procurement competency. Clearly, that's not always the case. So procurement need to manage this, right? What are you seeing in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really important point, James. And we're seeing that procurement teams are regularly having to handle disputes now. They're the ones that are managing the day-to-day supplier relationships. They're negotiating disagreements and trying to keep projects on track when they're not going to plan. In fact, about 70% of procurement teams say that they handle disputes themselves and that they only escalate to legal when it's absolutely necessary. I guess what's really interesting is the shift in perception. You mentioned that 9 out of 10 professionals now believe that dispute resolution should be considered a core procurement skill. That tells us that disputes aren't rare, but they're something that procurement teams deal with pretty regularly, and they're not just something that are passed to the legal team. So if procurement can step in and resolve issues effectively, they're not just preventing delays or saving money. They're actually protecting relationships and helping to maintain trust between the parties and ensuring continuity in the supply chain. And that's a huge part of delivering value.
Absolutely. And the skills that are required, the behaviours, toolkits, and also technology is going to come into this to support procurement, I think. This is all things we're going to touch on in episode 2. So there's a little teaser there early on for what we're going to be talking about more with. And Kurt, I know you do lots of training around this kind of thing. So we'll look forward to hearing more about that next episode. Kurt, in your experience, how does supply conflict with procurement, how can it affect long-term supplier relationships?
So the key thing is without suppliers, you haven't got a business. And the procurement's role is the interface between the business and the supplier. So the relationships they build has a massive impact with regarding to the profit and loss of the organization. Organizations have 3 main risks, and that's risk of reputation, risk to the brand, and risk of supply. If we haven't got supply of goods, we can't sell goods, make goods, we can't make profit, we can't look after our customers, and therefore our P&L goes down. 80% of a contract manager's job is relationship management. Internal relationship as well as connected relationship with the supplier. And also thinking about external stakeholders like governments, etc., to ensure there is harmony within that relationship. Relationship management and contract management absolutely hand in glove, because if you haven't got a good relationship, you haven't got a trusted supply chain, you've got poor risk management because things can happen, okay, with regard into that. And you're also not going to understand your costs and risks in your supply chain. You can achieve a lot more, and this is where procurement and supply chain professionals, and we'll talk about in the next session, are vital with regard into making sure they have the skill set to manage the relationship. They're the interface between the supplier and the business.
I think it just emphasizes why this matters so much to the profession, why we need to think about this from the end-to-end procurement lifecycle. And I think that speaks to the idea that procurement are really critical to business success. And that there are many reasons why, but the relationship with suppliers is foundational to what a business is providing, whether that be services or commodities or manufacturing, whatever it might be. Joe, final thoughts, really. And, I think I probably know the answer to this, but are disputes with suppliers avoidable, or actually are they inevitable? And if so, what do you think practitioners can do to kind of mitigate the risks of them happening, or when they do occur, to kind of mitigate the chances of them leading to 6-month disputes, as we talked about at the start?
Not all disputes are avoidable. And I think that's a key point. I'm sure that we wish that we could avoid them, but they're not all avoidable. And the white paper suggests that disputes aren't failures. They're just a normal part of doing business in complex relationships. If you're managing long-term contracts with multiple stakeholders, evolving requirements and external pressures, you've got to expect that there will be some challenges and friction. What's important is whether organizations have the capability to handle the challenges well. So things like proactive alignment, good documentation, and structured processes can reduce both the number and the severity of the conflict. But expecting zero disputes, that's unfortunately unrealistic.
Yeah, well, a nice note to end on for how we can mitigate them and the skills and behaviours that are required for episode 2, all leading into what's next and what's to come. Thank you both. You're really great to have you on. Really appreciate you joining us for this first episode of this series. We'll look forward to welcoming you back, Kurt, for episode 2. But thank you, Joe.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it.
And thank you, Kurt.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that's all for episode 1 of this Navigating Supplier Disputes mini-series. Thanks for joining us, and really appreciate the insights shared from Joe and Kurt there. As a reminder, we'll pop a link to the report findings from the recent CIPS resolution survey in the episode description. And we'll also add a link to the CIPS Skills Training Hub, with regular training courses available on the likes of negotiation and supplier relationship management to sign up for across the world, wherever you are. So do take a look at that when you get a chance. Do join us for our next episodes, where we'll be talking through skills, behaviours, and toolkits to manage supplier conflict. And thank you to CIPS official knowledge partners Resolution for partnering with us on this mini-series. That's it from episode 1 though. See you next time.